All right, so last week we started Psalm 2, and we're not going to talk a lot about this week, but we looked at the fact that Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 in later rabbinical tradition was looked at as kind of paired up. They were a liturgy or something that the king would use in some of the ceremonies at the temple. And the reason is that in Psalm 1, the focus is on the individual response of every individual to God. And if you've read Psalm 1 recently, that's going to click with you. The righteous man and the wicked man are contrast. The choices and the lifestyle of the righteous man. You know, you remember the old song, like a tree planted by the water, I will not be moved. That comes from Psalm 1, that phraseology. And that is the way the righteous man is seen. Keep your life right, submitted to God, focused on Him, and He will bless you like a tree by the water. You remember this is written in arid Middle East. So in the arid Middle East, you know, you look at Arabia, you look at even the Negev down in the southern part of Israel and that type of thing. Remember when Jesus went off and was tempted, He was in the desert, it says. He was in deserts are not just sandy. Some are just an arid environment where you get very little rain. I mean, parts of South Texas could be called desert. they get very little rain, you know, and most of that is a certain period of time. But this Psalm 1, you know, it's written by David, and he understands arid areas. And so when he talks about the righteous man being like a tree planted by the water, that is where a tree would want to be, where you had flowing water feeding your roots. And that's a symbolism of that close relationship where God is supplying all that we need as we walk in righteousness. And of course, the wicked man, it contrasts that. When we get to Psalm 2, it's a similar contrast, but it's nationally. In other words, the nation that submits to the Lord is the nation that is blessed. The nation that does not submit to the Lord, in fact, rebels against Him, is the nation that is foolish. Not just wicked, but foolish, especially when you know who God is. And so this is, as we pointed out last week, this is a psalm that is quoted more times in the New Testament than any other psalm. It's quoted 18 times in the New Testament. And I'm going to look at my numbers again. The closest psalm to that is Psalm 110, and it's quoted 7 times. So this is a pretty important psalm. And just a real brief, before we start to actually read the text, a real brief assistance on understanding the theological context here. Remember, He chose Abraham. He created a nation from Abraham in Egypt. He brought them out. He took them into the nation after 40 years of wandering because they were rebellious, right? They were rebellious. And He took them in. And so the nation that God created from Abraham was given all of those covenants that we always talk about. The Abrahamic covenant was the father of all those covenants. But you had from that a promise of that is their land forever. You had a promise that from the seed of David there would come a Messiah, and the period that this is written is kind of the period that they started to see that. Not just David as king, but because of the Davidic covenant, there was a promise that David and his descendants have the promise of having the promise of their reign, being able to reign when they're living in obedience to God forever. Forever. So as soon as you get the Davidic covenant, which comes in 2 Samuel 7, then you start to understand that Israel is not just a nation that's in part of the Bible. Israel is the core nation in the Bible. And it is the Bible that God will use, has used in the past, but will use in the future ultimately to be that light on a hill, to be salt and light. Remember, we apply those things out of the Sermon on the Mount to the church a lot of times, and it's because they're believers, we're believers, they're children of God, we're children of God. But you remember the Sermon on the Mount was to the Jews from their Messiah who had come to offer himself to them. And so God has chosen Israel and a Davidic descendant to reign over the world. And in that reign, for other nations to submit to the rule of the King of Israel. Now, that in our multi-nation, crazy world we live in today, where every nation wants to be sovereign and this, that, and the other, which is part of God's plan, by the way. That sounds crazy, that you have one nation that would rule over the world. But that is God's plan, and that will happen. And so, and think about this. Okay, when David was king, David was not a tyrant. In fact, Israel, all of Israel's battles against the nations around them were defensive. Israel didn't go in and force people like you think of Islam. You think of all those nations around them back then. If you got subjugated, which Israel did at times, if you got subjugated by them, you worshiped their God, a lot of times. So even, I want you to get a new picture of this whole thing, because even back then, God had chosen David to be king in Israel. And we talked about what's called a theocratic kingdom last year. So you have a situation in a fallen world, obviously. This is long after the fall. You have a situation where you have this planet that we live on. And God chooses one nation, and God is going to give them a perfect constitution. Remember, Paul would later say of the law that it was good and perfect and right, holy, it says. All of that. Perfect constitution, better than the Magna Carta, better than the Constitution of the United States, which are probably the two, historically, probably the two best constitutions ever written by mankind. The Magna Carta and the Constitution of the United States. As far as fairness and all of that type of thing. And of course, they were the best. I hate to throw lots of history in here, but they were the best because that was Western civilization, and Western civilization would not have existed had it not been for the Bible. Western civilization was built on the Bible. And so it's not surprising that two of the countries that developed as Western civilization came up with the finest human put together constitutions, because they were looking at truth in the Word of God. But under the Mosaic covenant, you had a perfect law. You had imperfect people trying to live it, and that was the problem. But you had a perfect law. And so if the nations around them had submitted to God's chosen leader, then they would have been blessed. In fact, they would have put their trust in the God of Israel, and they would have been blessed as a nation, and they would have got rid of all of their gods. Does that make sense? I don't know that I've ever thought of it that way until I studied this psalm in depth, but that is true. All of those other nations had other gods. In fact, you remember the reason why God brought them into that land and told them to go in and wipe out everybody living in that land is because of the ungodliness and unrighteousness involved. Those were horrible, horrible cultures who burned their kids up, offered their kids as sacrifices, and were into almost everything the Mosaic law forbids morally. They were involved in it. In fact, there's one place that it talks about. God says, I think it's in Deuteronomy, no, Leviticus, that's why the land spewed them out, because of their horrible sin. And and God set them among all those other nations. So think about that as we walk through this. Now, as I said also last week, this psalm is typically messianic in this sense. The principles of it apply from the time David wrote it and he was king forward. But the reason why this is quoted so many times in the New Testament is because ultimately it is the Messiah who is the king that will have the other nations submit to him. Does that make sense? Okay, so with all of that grand context and introduction, let's go ahead and read. We'll read the first 3 verses of Psalm 2. This is David writing this. And the reason why we know, I think I mentioned this last week, the reason why we know that David wrote this is that later, see if I can see a specific verse. In the New Testament, in Acts 13:33, Paul calls this the second. In Acts 4:25, Peter says that David wrote this psalm. And that's why we know David wrote it, because in the Old Testament it doesn't say who wrote it. Okay, so the title that the people who put this Bible together, my NASB, put over this psalm is the reign of the Lord's anointed. Another interesting thing is that the word Mashiach, and you've heard me say this, means anointed one. So, and I was just doing this study right before I came up here and discovered this. So the word, the Hebrew word Mashiach, or Messiah, used in its literal, before it became a technical term for Jesus, used in its literal meaning, was used of priests and kings. because both of them were anointed, right? So they were anointed ones, not the anointed one, but they were anointed ones. So if you look in your Hebrew Bible, it'll say Mashiach for those people. So there were many Mashiachs, there were many Messiahs, little m's in that sense. And these kings, all of the kings in David's line chosen to reign over Israel, if they were his descendants, they were all Mashiachs or Messiahs in a sense. All right, so here we go. Why are the nation? What do we have? Mark, why don't you read that?
Why do
Did it come on? You got to hold it until it turns green. Just here. Oh, you got it? Oh, no, that's me.
There it is. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. How far you want to go?
Through verse 3, you're good. Okay. So another thing that I wanted to correct, because I used a term wrongly the last Sunday night. I was talking about David, Saul, Solomon, others being co-regents. But co-regent means you're ruling on the same plane. Vice-regent is actually the term that I should have used, which means that these human kings were basically reigning in God's stead here on earth. All right? So I just wanted to correct that. So what's going on? This describes historical situation when this was written. So David says, why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed one, his Mashiach, his Messiah. But again, that's not talking about Jesus specifically there. That's talking about whoever the king of Israel is at the time. And so, did David have any battles against other nations? Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, he started his military career as a little boy with a slingshot, right? And who was that? You remember? The Philistines, right? Yeah, Goliath, the Philistines. And then, of course, he didn't become king until a little bit later than that. Eventually, Samuel would anoint him, so he became a Mashiach. Even when Saul was still serving as king, Saul tried to kill him. You know, how would you want to be in Saul's place when God had turned against Saul? Because remember what Saul did? He was supposed to go the Amalekites and wipe out everybody, and what did he do? He had a better idea. We've talked about this before. People who can't keep a job because they always have a better idea than the boss. Oh, I did better than what you told me. I did this and that and the other. It's like God said, no, you got to do exactly what I say. And so anyway, and then Saul was against David. But David had already been anointed as the king. So he was not in a good place there. And of course, eventually it caught up with him as the Philistines killed he and Jonathan and all of those. So you don't want to be on the opposite side of God's anointed one. You don't. And so these kings, this is what God wanted Israel to do, to live in a way that people submitted to him. He wanted Israel to live in a way that people submitted to him. And the way they could do that is to live out the law. And by the way, sometimes when we think of the law, we don't think of the kind side of the law, is what I call it. In other words, if they had sojourners, in other words, people from other countries that came through their country or whatever, they were supposed to be very kind to them. And that type of thing. How they treated Ruth, they were supposed to, there shouldn't have been a widow or an orphan in Israel that was not cared for. That's the kind of impact that it should have had, and probably did in their better years as a nation, where somebody loses their husband, their family care for them. There's no burden on the state. The families care for them. Somebody loses their parents, they're adopted, they're taken care of. All of this kind of stuff. And so it was a wonderful system that God created. No, they could never fully live up to the law, but they could, remember, even under the Old Testament, they could still be saved by faith, by trust. And like David said this morning, in fact, really the opposite of, we use faith more in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, the predominant word is used for somebody who had confidence in the Lord was trust. They trusted Him. And if you trust Him, you're going to live out the law. Not perfectly, but you sin, you're going to confess it, you're going to sacrifice to the priest, all that kind of stuff. So it was a wonderful system, and the nations were supposed to be attracted by that and come to trust God. And of course, as we know the history of Israel, they didn't do so well. But that's the situation here. So when David wrote this, and this is a continuing theme really all the way through the Bible, and it will be until the Messiah shows up in Revelation 19 and deals with the nations once and for all and establishes His righteous and benevolent rule here on earth. The nations were at odds with Israel. We're not submitting to you, And so that's the situation. And this is David's thinking. And remember, this is not just any nation. Just in defense of David, this is not just any nation. This is the nation that God created from Abraham. This is His chosen nation. To be in favor with God, you would submit to the king that God had placed over this nation and to this nation. And so that's why David says what he says. First he says, why are the nations in an uproar? I mean, all they had to do is be friendly to Israel and submit, learn about Yahweh and all that type of thing. Why are the nations in an uproar and the people devising a vain thing? Why is it vain when you're going against the Lord? What's the word vain mean? A vain thing. I mean, this is not something that is even going to happen. You're thinking of things that you're going to do against God and His elect nation, and He's God. So how successful do you think you're going to be? No. And the people devising a vain thing, the kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together. So again, think about this. David's thinking, okay, wait a minute. Our God is the God. There is no other God. He is the God. And we know from what Moses wrote, He's the one that spoke everything into existence. And He's the one that chose Abraham. He's the one that, remember, they know all of this. He's the one that destroyed the world. And only Noah, you see how your thinking changes when you know the truth and you think the truth? Of course, our thinking in this area is always battled against by secular thinking and all other false religions that Satan has devised to try to confuse us. But we know, and David knew, wait a minute, you're going to fight against God, and God spoke everything to existence. He destroyed everything that is the world. And if you understand, now that we have a lot of really good science on how the flood, not only how it happened, but how it transformed the surface of the earth. You talk about cataclysmic, splitting up the continent into all of these different continents and all this continental shift and stuff. God can do that. How in the world would you think that you can devise a plan against His nation and be successful? Unless He's the one that's permitting that, like with Assyria and Babylon. You see what? And listen, don't. And now that we're in the modern world, don't think that that's not the way God still operates. It is. I mean, the only reason that Israel has been in the mess that it's been in for 2,000 years is because they will not recognize their Messiah. When repentance comes, Israel, this will all be understandable by the nations during the tribulation period. Because all of a sudden, Jesus will take His church home. Those 7 years will start, like we talked about this morning. The nations will still be in an uproar, and they'll still try to take out Israel. You see the arrogance of what we saw this morning. This man that Satan is going to eventually indwell. In fact, I personally believe, as I look at the Scriptures, there's an indwelling that takes place, because this guy gets killed halfway through the tribulation, and he's resurrected. He comes back to life. And this guy's going to walk into the temple in God's chosen nation, in that land that He gave to them, and say, you're not worshiping Yahweh anymore. This raging is not over. From David's day to today, it has continued. But boy, the day they recognize Him as Messiah, everything will change. The Anointed One will return. And these nations that rage against Him, first of all, He's going to spend 7 years humiliating and pouring out wrath on those nations, on this earth, in a way that the world has never experienced before. The worst, the most horrible hurricanes, tornadoes, famine, wars, slaughter. You know, you think of World War II, horrible. World War I, horrible. The trench warfare, all the people that died just from being in those trenches. None of that, the Holocaust, none of that will compare to what we read in Revelation 6 through 19. God's anointed will rule over the nations. And so again, obviously David didn't know all of that New Testament stuff, but he did know who God was. Moses recorded all of that, and he knew who He was, and it didn't make any sense to him. So verse 3, this is their proclamation. After they've took counsel, they've all got together, all these military minds have gotten together, and they said, man, we can use this and that and this and that, and we're just going to obliterate Israel. This is what, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords for us. That tells you immediately that these people have absolutely no idea who God is. Listen, most of the world in the day we live in has no idea who God is. Think about that. They don't. You know, all the other false religions, they don't know who their creator is. They don't. Even a lot of Christendom. You know, a lot of the churches, I'm going to only use this example because I know it to be true. Catholicism, they discarded literal creation long time ago. Most Catholics are evolutionists. Oh, many Protestants are evolutionists. You know, how does that affect your perception of who God is? When you believe that God just kind of produced some stuff and let evolution take over. I mean, no, that's not what the Bible says. And so there's going to be an awakening someday for these nations. And you see it in Revelation 6. And the one that's worthy to open that scroll is our Lord Jesus Christ, the line of Judah, you know. And he is going to open that scroll, and it is going to be chaos, mayhem, death, destruction on this earth. This great kingdom that Satan and the Antichrist has planned that they're going to create here on the earth, it's not going to be fun for them. I'll promise you. So, let's go ahead and have somebody read verses 4 through 6 for right now.
He who sits in the heavens shall laugh, and the Lord shall hold them in derision, and he shall speak to them in his wrath, and distress them in his deep displeasure. I have set the king on the holy hill of Zion.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm gonna just read my version. Not that wasn't good. I love the words. I love the way the NASB translate this. By the way, if you remember last week, we talked about, and one of the commentators pointed this out, it's like a camera. So the camera is on the nations at first, those first 3 verses. And then the camera looks up in the heavens where God is and describes. And of course, these are what we call anthropomorphic expressions. Remember, God is not his essence is spirit. So he has no body. That's why, like we've seen in Ezekiel, that's why we've seen he appears in certain ways to have an impact on certain people, especially like prophets, so they can prophesy. But for us to understand a God that is essence, sometimes it's helpful language-wise to use terms that describe how a man is, sees and feels and all this kind of stuff, which reflects him but not his physical body. So this is how mine reads. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Them goes back, if you're following the pronouns, which we've talked about a lot lately, if you're following the pronouns, them refers back to the rulers, the kings, the nations, the peoples, all of these people who are taking counsel against the Lord. That Lord is in my version, probably yours too. It's in all caps. And the reason why is that's Yahweh, the Hebrew Yahweh. And of course, Mashiach is the anointed one there. So that would be Yahweh and his chosen anointed king here on earth. He says, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Now, God's not sitting up there going, like that. But this is the attitude of God toward those who reject him and those who think that somehow they're going to devise a plan to overthrow him, the creator of all things. That is comical, is it not? It is comical. Somebody who can bring a worldwide flood and wipe out everybody on the earth, to think all of a sudden you've come up with a plan. I mean, think of the most incredible weapons. We live in a day where we have the most incredible weapons that mankind has ever had for destroying each other. You think that makes it up to wherever God is in another dimension? You think he's worried about that? Is he shaking? No, he's laughing. He's laughing. And by the way, I don't think this, knowing the character of God, this is not God laughing in the sense of, I don't care. And how do I know that? Because he sent his anointed here to die for these people. Does that make sense? He died for the whole world, John said. The whole world. That means everybody that's ever lived and ever will live. Jesus Christ died for them. I believe in unlimited atonement. He had died for everyone on this that'll ever live on this planet. And so God is not thrilled or happy when man rejects him. But the humor of them thinking that somehow they're going to overthrow God and his anointed and take over the world. I mean, that's the driving force of Satan, really. That satanic idea that somehow he's going to be like God. He's going to come up with some idea, even though he knows all of this because it's all recorded and he knows it all. He still lives in the delusion, that pathology of thinking that somehow he's going to overthrow God. And of course, he encourages that and infuses that in the minds and hearts of unbelievers to believe that that can actually happen. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury. Now, I'm thinking right now, and y'all can go look at it later, in the end of Revelation 6, in the beginning of Revelation 6, Jesus starts to open those seals. He takes the seals off. And again, the way I see the seals, having studied that in depth and trying to figure out how in the world were there, you know, most of the time you think of a scroll and whether it was animal skin or papyrus, whatever the scroll was, you know, you see a scroll is all wrapped up and wax is melted on it and the seal of the person sending it is pushed down on it. And that holds it together until it gets to whoever it's going to. And if that wax seal is broken, the guy carrying it probably should just go hide somewhere, go to a far, far country somewhere. But the seal that Jesus opens is a little different. This is just kind of a side note. The seal that Jesus opens, it has the scroll, it has 7 seals on it. And he breaks all 7. So as I see that, apparently when the scroll was rolled up, you get to a certain point where the last seal is, seal judgment is, and he sealed that. And then he rolled it again, and put another seal on it and another seal. That's the only way you could break one and then break another one. Does that make sense? That's logically the way I see it. And so in Revelation 6, so the Lamb who's worthy, and of course he's worthy because he's purchased the world with his blood. And so he brings those first four, the horsemen, the four horsemen. He opens those seals and those horsemen come on the scene. And then he opens the fifth one, and the fifth one is where it's kind of like this. You go back up to heaven, and in heaven you see all of the people that had already been murdered, which means, I'm not trying to teach Revelation, but I'm trying to put this all together. Revelation 7 is where you have the 144,000 Jews sealed who start to evangelize. So that has to happen really, really early, because if by number 5 you already have martyrs, that means those Jews are the books that were left behind, are the people who had heard the gospel, and all of a sudden they said, oh no, that was really true. And got saved. I don't know who, but somebody's been sharing the gospel or hearing about the gospel in some way, because you already have those martyrs. But my point is, the next scene that you see is you see these people on earth realizing what's going on. And they're crawling in caves, and they're asking that rocks fall on them and cover them from... Let me just read that, because I think that's exactly how this is going to play out. I know it is. Ultimately, in the end, Revelation 6, verse 12. The sixth seal, I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree cast its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind, probably asteroids. That's probably what that's talking about. The sky was split apart like a scroll, and when it rolled up, and every mountain and when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Listen to this. Then the kings of the earth and the great men, the commanders and the rich and the strong, and every slave and free man hid themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of who? Of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? This is when ultimately Psalm 2 will be fulfilled for the last time. Because this is what's going to happen. Which tells me that indicates that somehow, some way, they know where this is coming from. Whether they can see or what, you read that carefully, they know where it's coming from. So that's that. That's why it says, then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Now, Zion, the holy mountain, that's the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Just two different ways of saying that. And of course, my king there ultimately will be Jesus, right? I mean, ultimately it will be Jesus, but throughout history, it has been others, David Saul, David, Solomon, and on forward. Did we read verse 7? Okay. Can you read that, Susan? We're going to give you one more try with the microphone on.
I will declare the decree. The Lord said to me, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you."
Okay, let me just comment on 7 before you keep going. So this is not talking about physical birth. And we can talk about this more next time because we're almost out of time. This is talking about coronation day for a king. And so this is why it talks about his son David. God inspired the writers to write about David, his son. This is also said about Jesus, right? This is where, and we'll talk about this more next time. This is where, is it Caiaphas? I think it's Caiaphas. Jesus is standing before Caiaphas. This is when the Sanhedrin meet. This is right at the end of the trial period. You know, he went to Annas, and then he went to Herod, Caiaphas, back to somewhere. Anyway, I don't remember all the court dates, but in the end, I believe it was Caiaphas said, "I adjure you, are you the Christ, the Son of God?" And he said, "You have said it." And this is where, this is, as the messianic understanding developed through Psalms and even more detail through the Old Testament, and especially the prophets, they realized that the Messiah would be the Son of God, and to admit that, he was admitting, "I am the Messiah, and I'm the Son of God." And of course, they said that's blasphemy. Well, for anybody else, that would have been blasphemy. But when that's who you are, it's not blasphemy. But they put him to death. So that's kind of a tie here. All right, we'll go ahead and close. We'll start there. I'm going to put a little mark because there's more to talk about in verse 7 than that. And not next week, it'll be about 4 weeks, about a month from now, we'll be back here and we will try to finish the psalm up. So, all right. Chris, can you pray for us to close our time, please, sir?